There are some choices in life, some decisions, which have extremely long-reaching implications, long-reaching consequences and effects. Fork-in-the-road moments, which maybe you don't realize it at the time, but you look back at that decision and you're like, oh my gosh, that changed everything when I made that choice. Maybe you decide to purchase tickets for a concert, and it's like, these are a little steep, but you end up going, and you meet someone who later becomes your wife at this concert. I mean, that's kind of a decision that changed everything, right? I mean, imagine if you just said, I don't want to drive all the way up to Sacramento or whatever it is. I'm just going to stay here. I'm not going to buy that ticket. Your life would look entirely different if you didn't make that choice. Or I know there's some people in here taking AP tests, some students. The decision to, decide what major you're going to study in college can be a pretty big one. I mean, studies say that it's something like 20 to 30% of your entire life is spent at work. So deciding on a career trajectory is a pretty big thing. But this concept can also be looked at, negatively too. Think about alcoholics or drug addicts. That first moment when they were offered a drink or the substance was passed their way, they had a choice, and that affected their trajectory in life as well. Well, it's these kind of fork-in-the-road moments, these decisions, that Jesus is addressing in the conclusion of his Sermon on the Mount. This is the Sermon on the Mount, depicted graphically for you, which I love to do. 3 chapters, Sermon on the Mount, 5, 6, and 7. Each chapter you can kind of look at topically in 2 halves. A couple months ago now, Jonathan opened us up in the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, looking at the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, and then turned outwards, teaching us that we, as the people of God, are both the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And then Jesus informed us in his introduction that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And he transitioned from that comment about the law to a series of what we now call antitheses, in which he says, you have heard that it was said this, but I say to you. Not abolishing the Old Testament law in doing that, but rather teaching its true meaning. And he transitions from there, still keeping his eye on the Pharisees and the way that they've kind of twisted some of the Old Testament traditions to speak about righteousness, and specifically the self-righteousness of certain classes of religious people who want to do their giving and their praying and fasting very publicly before all people, so as to receive the reward of man's praise. But God says, no, don't seek that kind of reward. Seek the reward that I will give you, and therefore do your giving and your praying and fasting in secret before an audience of one. Transitions from there to talk about possessions, that we're not to store up treasures on earth, as easy as that is, but we should really be thinking about keeping our heavenly storehouses well stocked. And last week, Jonathan took us through the first half of chapter 7, a section which I struggle to put a label on personally, and so do the commentaries that I've read. But in this section, judgment and the golden rule and praying before a Father who wants to hear our prayers is addressed. And this takes us to the last bit of the Sermon on the Mount, which we're going to address in 2 Sundays, me and Jonathan next week, the conclusion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Now, in this conclusion, Jesus, he puts forward a set of contrasts. And he encourages his audience to do a little bit of self-evaluation, to ask some questions about themselves and where they're at. Here are the contrasts, 3 of them. Oh, excuse me. 2 gates, 2 trees, and 2 houses. There's a narrow gate, and there's a wide gate. There's a tree that produces fruit, and then there's one that only produces thorns and thistles. And finally, you're probably familiar of the house that's built on the rock, and then the other one that's built on the sand. And Jesus is asking, I've just presented my pretty lengthy sermon to you. Where do you think you land? Is your house built on sand, or is it built on the rock of my word? Well, we're going to look at only the first of these contrasts this morning, just the two gates. And I've arranged the material for you kind of so as to demonstrate the parallels. And let me read it. Enter through the narrow gate, Jesus says, for the gate is wide and the way is easy, which leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. So Jesus is clearly presenting a contrast here. We got a wide gate and a narrow gate. We have an easy way and a hard way, and we're asked to choose. It's a fork in the road moment, and we're going to look at this choice from a couple of different angles. We're going to first examine what this narrow gate is, and then we're going to look at the hard way. First the narrow gate, and then the hard way. So, the narrow gate. Well, we began this series in Matthew all the way back in December. And this series was commenced on the heels of a series in the book of Exodus. We went from Exodus right into Matthew, and that was an intentional choice. The gentlemen back there, I think, are going to pass some Bibles out. I always forget to tell them to do that, sorry. We went from Exodus to Matthew intentionally because the Gospel of Matthew is, as many people will say, the most Jewish of the Gospels. He has so many little fulfillment statements in which he says that this happened so as to fulfill what the prophet had spoken. But also, it's because the author of this Gospel, Matthew, he goes through great pains to demonstrate the parallels between the biblical character of Moses and our Savior, Jesus. Parallels between these two people. And we've brought these parallels up as we've preached through this series. Moses, you might remember, he fled from Egypt after taking the life of an Egyptian taskmaster. Well, we find Jesus early on in the gospel fleeing to Egypt after Herod is trying to take his life. Moses then he passes through the waters of the Red Sea. Remember with chapter 14 and 15 of Exodus? He passes through the waters of the Red Sea, and Jesus, he passes through the waters of baptism. Now, right after Moses and Israel goes through the waters of the Red Sea, they go into the wilderness. For how long? For 40 years. Now, Jesus, after he's baptized in chapter 3, going through the waters, he goes in chapter 4 into the wilderness for 40 days, where he's tempted by the devil. Moses, he climbs up a mountain, Mount Sinai, to receive the law from God. And Jesus, he goes up a mountain too. We call it the Sermon on the Mount, and there he explains the law of God to the people. Well, there's a final point of comparison I want to make for you this morning between Jesus and Moses. It turns out that Jesus and Moses, and Joshua too, we'll find out in a minute, both these guys, they share tastes in sermon conclusions. Their sermon conclusions kind of look a little familiar, one to the other. Jesus, he presents contrasts, and he asks his audience to choose between the two. Contrasts and a choice. Moses does the same thing. So you might be aware of this. The book of Deuteronomy, the fifth book in the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, is pretty much one long sermon. Some people say it's 3 sermons kind of cinched together, but it's a sermon that Moses delivers to the people of Israel after they've wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. And before they cross the Jordan River and go and fight the Battle of Jericho. So they're on what's called the Plains of Moab, and Moses is delivering a lengthy sermon to the people of Israel. And it's kind of like a locker room speech before the big game, trying to get Team Israel pumped up. Obey God, follow the commandments, walk before the Lord, and you will be blessed in the promised land that you're about to enter. Well, the conclusion of this sermon I suppose probably start somewhere in around chapter 27, but we're going to pick it up in chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, and we're going to look for contrasts and a choice. Deuteronomy 30. See, Moses says, I have set before you life and good, death and evil. Now, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, then the Lord will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you will surely perish. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. Now, what do you suppose is meant by those words, I have set before you? Moses says, I've set before you life and good, death and evil. Well, you should be grateful that I'm not preaching a 34-chapter sermon to you this morning like Moses did in the book of Deuteronomy. You see, all the way back in chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, Moses began speaking about the laws that God presented to Israel. Chapters 12 through 26 are a big block of rehashing a lot of the laws presented in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Laws of God, 12 to 26. 27 and 28 are 27 is the blessings that God will lavishly pour out on Israel if they follow those laws. And then 28 are the curses for their disobedience. And then 29 and 30 is that kind of final locker room speech. Follow the laws of God, and he will lavishly bless you. So what we have here is this presentation of the law of God, which they're fully aware of, the consequences of blessing and curse for keeping those laws, and then this push to follow the laws of God and obey him and receive his blessings. Well, this is so similar to Jesus here in his conclusion on the Sermon on the Mount. You see, the wide and the narrow gate, just as with Moses it led to blessing and curse, so Jesus says that these decisions will lead either to destruction or life, he says. Now, this can seem a little bit, for those who are familiar with theology and how this works, it can be a little bit disconcerting. Doesn't this sound a little bit like salvation by works, and we just have to earn our own salvation? Well, that's certainly not true, and we have to consider the whole canon of Scripture when we come to things like this. And we realize that there's flexibility in some of these metaphors, because Jesus, we learn, is both the gate and the way that leads to life. Remember in John 10, he says, I am the gate for the sheep. I am the gate, and whoever enters through me will be saved. The thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. See this? Jesus is the gate that leads to life, and he's the way. John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. See, excuse me. The creator of the universe ordained that there would be one way to pass into his presence, and that would be through his only Son. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The creator of the universe made this system, and he said, no, through my Son, you will pass into life. But the thing is, ever since then, we've been trying to find other ways, haven't we, to enjoy fellowship with God. And usually it involves some form of, I'm good enough, aren't I? Well, last weekend, we missed church on Sunday, and we were down in Southern California for a wedding. And we missed the Jerry and Sanji's wedding. Sad to have missed that. But we caught my cousin's wedding, and it was a Sunday wedding. And we were down for the whole weekend. and we had all day Saturday to spend time with family. And what better way to spend time with family than to see the new Avengers movie, right? But foolishly, we got up on Fandango only that morning, and of course all the tickets were purchased. So no new Avengers movie for us that weekend. But we decided to settle for the next best thing, which is an old Avengers movie. So we watched the first Avengers to kind of prepare ourselves for Infinity War. And there's this moment in that movie, the first Avengers movie, where one of the Avengers, one of the heroes, her name is Black Widow. She's a former, I think, like Soviet spy or something like that. The Black Widow is having a conversation with the big bad guy of the movie, Loki, the Norse god of mischief. And they're having this little conversation about why she, this former spy, would join this group of heroes, the Avengers. And she says, "I got red on my ledger, and I like to wipe it out. There's debts that I want to pay, and I think if I do this, I can help to balance the scales a little bit." But Loki turns it around, and he asks, "Can you? Can you wipe out that much red? I've seen your ledger, and it is dripping. It is gushing with red." And you know what? If we're honest, all of our ledger looks like that. We all have debts that we are not capable of paying. It doesn't work that way to simply try to balance the scales. Maybe if I'm just more good than I am bad, if I'm 51% good and 49% bad, that's good enough, right? God doesn't intend to surround himself with a bunch of 51%ers in heaven. He wants images of his Son. Well, that's why he devised a better way and a better gate. Colossians 2 says, "You who were dead in your trespasses, God made alive together with Jesus, having forgiven us all of our trespasses by canceling that record of debt, that read on our ledger, that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, doing so by nailing it to the cross." Who are we as Christians but those who have walked through the narrow gate with a record of debt in our hands and given it over to Jesus, who takes it and nails it to the cross, first going through his own hands? Well, we've seen Moses' conclusion. Now let's look at Joshua's quick. Joshua, Moses' successor, he had a similar taste in sermon conclusions. We've already heard his conclusion, his sermon is found in Joshua 23 and 24, but his conclusion you can probably find embroidered somewhere in your grandma's house. It reads like this: "Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house," this is the grandma's embroidery part, "we will serve the Lord." Right? Isn't that amazing? "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Now, I've arranged it in this kind of hokey way for you to highlight the importance of one word, the word serve. Look how this bit of embroidery fits in the rest of the context of chapter 24. "Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord, rather. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, fine. Choose this day whom you're going to serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But that's not for me. As for me and my house," Joshua says, "we will serve the Lord." Joshua's audience was at one of those fork-in-the-road moments. The promised land was conquered. It was theirs. There's this line in Joshua that says that not one word of God's good promises to you have failed. He promised to give them the land, and he fulfilled that promise. And now they found themselves in a kind of a second Garden of Eden. All of Israel now in a second Garden of Eden. And they had that choice, like Adam and Eve did, to take of that fruit or to follow the Lord in obedience. to decide whom they would serve. So, who do you serve this morning? Who is the center of your universe? What matters most to you? What do you find yourself organizing all of your life around? Is it yourself? Your needs, your wants, your desires, your plans, retirement, vacation time? Or is it the one who created you? If it's true that God created us, knit us together in our mother's womb, then we're created for him and for his purposes. And our purpose then is to know him, to serve him, and to delight in him, and him in us too. Colossians 2:15 says that he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. See how this has the potential to change everything, to change your outlook on life? Once you realize that it's not about you, that's kind of a glorious realization, I think. It takes a lot of the pressure off. Well, we've looked at the narrow path. Let's look at the hard way. C.S. Lewis, author of the amazing Chronicles of Narnia, wrote several other works of fiction, one of which is a book called The Screwtape Letters. It's a really fascinating book, The Screwtape Letters. So in this book, it's a series of letters. Each chapter is a letter. Letters from one demonic figure to another. That's what the Screwtape Letters are all about. Screwtape is the name of one demon, and he's this high-ranking demon. And I guess this demon has a nephew, and the nephew's name is Wormwood. The nephew's name is Wormwood, and Screwtape is writing letters to Wormwood, advising him on how to secure the damnation of someone called the Patient. That's Wormwood's job, is to make sure this person called the Patient, some British citizen during the years of World War II, would make it to hell at the end of his life. So C.S. Lewis kind of looks at the other perspective of things. He's just so good at that. And when we begin reading these letters, we see that the Patient is a church attender, but he's slipping a little bit. He's backsliding. And Screwtape tells Wormwood, you must not let your patient realize that he's slipping. You must keep this a secret from him. Because if he knows he's in trouble, well, he might do something about it, and we don't want that to happen. Screwtape writes, indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. Wide is that gate, and easy is that way, and many enter through it. You see, Wormwood sought to lull his patient into the belief that his Christianity made no demands upon him. If he, was one of those check-the-box Christians, showed up at church every once in a while just to clear his conscience and then get that one-way ticket to heaven after he died. No need to read or pray or serve or really even engage in a relationship with the Lord. But see, the Lord doesn't want check-the-box believers. He wants followers of Jesus, those who image him and look like his son. We're probably pretty familiar with the passage in James 2, which says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says that he has faith but does not have works? If his life hasn't actually changed, if it doesn't look any different than it did before, can that faith save him? James asked. If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking daily food, and one of you says to him, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without actually giving him the things he needs for the body, what good is that? So, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. John says a similar thing in 1 John. If anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in this person? So also, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and truth. You can sing, I have decided to follow Jesus, till you're blue in the face. If there's no change on the outside, there's a pretty good chance there's no change on the inside either. But this process, it isn't automatic. It's not the kind of thing where after you're saved, legitimately saved, and you've been given a new heart and the Spirit's inside of you, it's not as if God takes over at that moment. He takes over, you're on autopilot, and you wake up a few years later, and all of a sudden you're Mother Teresa. And the work is done, and you're completely holy. The Christian life, as God has designed it, requires work and discipline and effort. But it's a hard work, it is, but it's a good work, and it's a work that Jesus himself has partnered with us in. Look at these effort passages. 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says, I worked harder than any of them. I worked harder than anyone, he says, but it was not I. It was the grace of God working through me. Philippians 2. Work out your salvation, Paul says, with fear and trembling. Take this seriously. For it is God who works in you to will and to work for his good pleasure. Train yourselves like an athlete. Train yourselves for godliness. For to this end we toil and we strive because we have set our hope on the living God. Peter finally says, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, virtue with knowledge. Make that effort. It requires work, he says. We not only have the ability to become more holy, to battle against our sins and to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit, but we're called to do so. And this idea was most impressed upon my heart in reading a book called The Mortification of Sin. That's a book with a doozy of a title, isn't it? The Mortification of Sin. I read that book while in college with a group of buddies. Our college pastor challenged us to read old books, and this one certainly qualifies. Written in 1656, I think it was, The Mortification of Sin by a Puritan pastor named John Owen. Real heady guy. It's a book that's pretty much an exposition of just one verse from the Bible. Romans 8:13, as read in the Old King James, which is what John Owen would have been using, says, if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. Mortify means to put to death, to kill. It's like the word mortal is someone who is perishable. It involves a habitual weakening of the flesh or the sinful nature in you, crucifying the flesh, as Paul said. And it's talking about a specific, concentrated effort to wage war against those certain areas of sin struggle in your life. In the opening chapter of this book, John Owen says, I ought to make it my business, he says, all my days to mortify this indwelling power of sin. And he gives a series of what he calls directives for how to go about this process of engaging against the flesh and trying to the Spirit. He says, you ought to try to get a constant longing after deliverance from this sin. There are certain things that enslave you. Do you desire to be free and gain victory from them? This is where you have to start. Next, he says, consider the tendencies, all of the tendencies of this particular sin, and watch against them all. Is there do you respond or act or say certain things when you're in certain company? Be aware of that. And lastly, rise mightily. I love that phrase. Rise mightily against the first actings of thy distemper. Right in that moment where you have that opportunity to choose one path or another, rise mightily to choose the godly path. Well, this is all good and well, but can you pull that off even for one day? Moses and Joshua, they certainly didn't think so. Remember Joshua? He says, choose this day whom you will serve. So that's verse 15. And then 16, 17, and 18, the people say, we're going to serve the Lord. It's going to be great. I can't wait. It's going to be awesome. And then verse 19, Joshua says, you guys, it's not going to go the way you think. You are not able to serve the Lord. And then Moses, at the beginning of his conclusion to his sermon, right after he gives the blessings for obedience and then the curses for disobedience, he says, when all these things come upon you, the blessings, but also the curses. You see, he knows that Israel is going to fail. And that's why we so desperately need Jesus. We need his work on the cross. Someone who won't fail. You see, this cross work of Jesus, it accomplishes two things for us. It accomplishes our atonement and our sanctification. With the atonement, the price has been paid for our mistakes. That red in our ledger is wiped clean. But we have another need. We need to be sanctified. We need to be made like Jesus. And the cross accomplishes that. It's the help we need to progressively become more like him. We as sheep have all gone astray, but he as the good shepherd is the one who brings us back to that narrow road. These are our deepest needs. And they were my needs as well as a little 6-year-old in the backyard of our family friend's house when I got the idea, the pretty bad idea, to pull off every one of the flower buds of this giant camellia bush. This flower bush. I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to rip off every single one of those buds. And I don't know why I did it. Maybe I needed ammunition to throw at my brothers or something like that. But that was a pretty costly mistake. That bush needed to be ripped out and replaced. I needed that mistake to be atoned for someone to come in and say, okay, little 6-year-old David, I don't think your piggy bank has enough pennies in there to pay for a new camellia bush. But mine does. Mine is of infinite worth, and I'm gonna pay that price for you. But you know what? I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to sanctify you. I'm going to teach you what you've done, ripping this bush to pieces. That's not the path to life, and that's not the path to beauty. I'm going to make you into a little gardener. I'm going to show you how to bring new life into this world, because that's your purpose. That's why I've created you and designed you, to bring life and joy into other people's lives. So have you decided to follow Jesus? Have you made that decision? Is your deepest need for atonement satisfied? We all have red on our ledger. Has it been wiped out by the work of Jesus on the cross? He stands ready to accept that ledger, ready to accept your record of debt. Or perhaps are you staying on that hard road? Or maybe have you strayed from it? Is there some wormwood who's snuck in and tried to convince you, stop trying so hard. Why are you taking this all so seriously? Just relax a little. God is gracious. He longs to walk with you. Return to him. Let's pray.